love for McDonald's, and Vice President Harris's fond memories working under the arches. And they say, while we on our franchise don't have records for all positions dating back to the early 80s, noting again, they're basically saying that people wanting them to say whether Kamala Harris worked there, they're like, look, that's in the 1980s. We don't have records on that stuff. They're saying that what makes us 1 in 8 so powerful is the shared experience so many Americans have. You've been seeing a lot of news outlets kind of roll with that in different ways. Some are saying McDonald's admits that they don't have records of her working there. What they're actually saying is they don't have records of employment data, like broadly in the early 80s. They weren't confirming or denying it. And so some people were taking that and kind of running with it in different ways, right? Basically, though, McDonald's is making another point, though. The technicalities here matter. What McDonald's really points to is the main issue. For Americans, it is one of those shared experiences. It's relatable. And I know people in Europe and other countries kind of laugh at us, like, oh, Americans and their McDonald's. I love McDonald's. You know what I mean? I have fantastic memories of McDonald's. I think a lot of Americans do, to be honest. Really, a lot of us have good memories with McDonald's. It's actually true. And so, politically, it actually probably will win somebody some points for having worked there. It's just how it is. But look, folks, in other news, there's a new assessment out on a school shooting in Iowa, something pretty serious. But I want to be talking about this after we come back from a quick break. Points to, I think, a broader issue in our society that I want to talk about. Now, look, in Iowa, there was recently a school shooting. Again, pretty serious topic, right? But we're hearing some early warning signs that were there. This is often what you hear, right? There's a school shooting or some kind of terrible event, and they know that the individual was being monitored. There were warning signs and so on, and people say, how could this have happened? The Epic Times said this. They say the teenage shooter who opened fire at Perry High School in Iowa on January 4th had likely shown warning signs prior to the attack and had a fascination with school shootings, according to state officials. It says the Dallas County Attorney's Office released its investigation report on October 17, detailing the timeline of the shooting that killed 11-year-old sixth grader Amir Jalif and school principal Dan Marburger. And it said 6 people, including 4 students, were injured in the shooting, according to the report. And the 17-year-old shooter, Dylan Butler, took his own life shortly after carrying out the attack. And as the report also found that Butler had likely exhibited warning signs that went unrecognized or unreported. Evidence indicated that his actions were driven by a desire to commit suicide with the hostile intent of taking others with him, it stated. Now look, it's terrible, of course. It's one of the worst things that happens. But it also brings up the issue of, well, what do you do about early warning signs like this? Like, what is the actual actionable thing for that? Because, look, it's become a common statement when there's a school shooting or a similar incident, we hear the individual was, on the FBI's radar, or people were warning about them, that there were calls, that they were telling the police, this individual is problematic. But the question is, what do you do with information like that? You can't charge somebody with a crime unless they commit a crime. We don't have pre-crime. Can you jail a person just on suspicion that they may commit a crime? What can authorities do? This raises a real fundamental point. Now, there's some exceptions to this. Counterterrorism laws, for example, the Patriot Act, again, after 9/11, a lot of that was instituted. Now, with the anti-terrorism laws, there are people who, again, get thrown in prison or Guantanamo Bay, for example. A lot of the cases on that, though, it could be an individual showing warning signs. They may get set up by federal agents who maybe offer them, fake explosives or guns. And when they act on, again, a terror attack, the agents arrest them. Again, not actually carrying it out, but, using maybe fake explosives or take action to commit that crime. Now, even that is kind of legally shaky in some analysis. Some people say, well, is that entrapment? How does that work? The idea, though, is that if people posing as terrorist recruiters did not do that, if they didn't pretend to be terror recruiters and get somebody to actually try to carry an attack in a way that may not harm people, The concern is that somebody else might get to them instead, right? And so this is regarded as kind of a safety net against terrorist attacks. Now, some groups suggest the answer to things like this, with individuals exhibiting these early warning signs we keep hearing about. Some say the answer is red flag laws. This is, of course, where if an individual is showing signs of violence or mental illness or things that may make them a risk to themselves or others, that authorities can take their guns. Now, some people are very much against that. I know Donald Trump at one point actually seemed to back it. He got some criticism for it and some support for it. This is not really a right or left issue. There are people on the right who support it. There are people who don't. People who normally support Second Amendment, some like it, some don't. But that is one of the solutions people are posing to resolve this problem. Some have also suggested that we bring back mental institutions. Now, technically, right? If a person is threatening to harm themselves or harm others, if you're a danger to yourself or a danger to others, then that, traditionally at least, could trigger you getting sent to a mental institution. The psychiatric hospitals, right? Now, they closed a lot of them down.
Yeah.
This was a big question I think we've had as a society since that time. Again, a lot of the psychiatric hospitals, they closed in the 1960s. That was under President John F. Kennedy. And they were replaced instead with like community health centers or behavioral health centers and things of that sort. Voluntary places you go if you feel you have problems or suicidal thoughts or something like that, right? Psychiatric hospitals, of course, they had a lot of problems also. Weird medical experiments, people being abused, lobotomies. There were some terrible things. Now, you could say that, well, that's because of the time. They've been closed since the 1960s. And if you look at, frankly, prisons and everything like that, the world has changed quite a bit from that time. It's very unlikely that mental hospitals today would work like they did back in like the 30s or 40s. But given some of the issues we're now seeing with mental instability and crime, for example, some of the subway crime in New York, a lot of people say it's people with severe mental illness. Some are calling for the return of psychiatric hospitals based on that, because a lot of individuals who are repeat criminals seem to suffer from mental illness. This is becoming a problem. Now, personally, I would say, when I view, again, kids doing terrible things like this, school shootings, I'd actually point back to an old court case, Leopold Loeb. This was one of the more famous cases. It's a pretty old case. Basically, there were two young boys who wanted to commit the perfect crime. They were extremely well educated. They were very wealthy. They ended up kidnapping and murdering, I believe it was the cousin of one of the individuals, and did it in a really horrific way. Long story short, one of the individuals dropped his glasses, traced back to him, they caught him, arrested him. And the trial was interesting because this brought up a debate in society. They said, how is it that two very well-to-do boys, again, great education, very wealthy, no problems, nothing that would trigger a person to normally commit a crime, would do something this horrific? And the social debate at that time was this. They said, well, it's because they're being taught in school that God doesn't exist. Take it for what it is. I'm just saying this was the debate.
Yeah.
But it brought up the debate of, well, look, if you're teaching kids that there is no consequence for wrongdoing, then why should they care about doing things that we traditionally think is being right? If you don't believe in good and evil, then what incentive is there to be good? And if schools are telling kids there's no such thing as that, then what are schools doing? And are they leading them in a good way or a bad way? That was the social debate we began having as a society, and that debate ended. I don't think people really talk about that anymore. But I think, again, you can only police people so much, especially if they haven't yet committed a crime. You can only do so much. A lot of, again, prevention for crime is internal. The person having their own moral compass and saying, I find that terrible and I would never do such a thing. That internal restraint is what's often missing. And you can't, manufacture that externally. A lot of that, again, does come from a person's own moral compass, which is typically rooted in their moral values, which does tend to be rooted in whatever faith they have, or lack thereof. And look, on a side note, we saw a lot of destruction in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton. I was actually on the ground in North Carolina